The courtroom was silent except for the rhythmic sound of the judge's gavel. A case that had captured the attention of the public was now in its most critical phase. The defense attorney, a slick professional with years of experience, leaned forward as he passionately presented his closing arguments. The prosecutor, across the aisle, stood firm, waiting for his turn to respond, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, and every word that was spoken seemed to carry a weight far beyond its meaning. But there, in the back row, sitting quietly, was a little girl, barely 8 years old. She sat with her mother, her small figure barely noticeable in the sea of adults surrounding her. Her wide eyes flicked between the proceedings, but she wasn't paying attention in the way most people were. While others were absorbed in the legal drama unfolding before them, the girl's gaze was fixed intently on one specific spot, the defense table. Sitting beside the defense attorney, under the shadow of his large chair, was a calm figure that drew her eyes again and again. It was her dog. A large, well-trained service animal, the dog sat motionless, its glossy fur a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the courtroom. Most of the room didn't pay any mind to the animal. After all, it wasn't unusual for service dogs to accompany individuals with specific needs. But for the little girl, her dog wasn't just a companion. It was her anchor, her protector, and she trusted it with something far greater than anyone could imagine. Her fingers twitched imperceptibly, sending a signal through the air, a small, deliberate movement that only the dog could detect. The dog's ears flicked, and for a brief moment, its eyes locked onto hers. It shifted ever so slightly, but remained perfectly still. Despite the calm exterior, there was an undercurrent of tension, of silent communication being exchanged between the two. The courtroom, filled with so many people and so much noise, seemed to fade away for the girl. In this moment, all that mattered was her bond with her dog and the signals she was sending. The defense attorney continued speaking, his voice loud and confident, but the little girl's mind was far away from the legal jargon being thrown around. Her focus never wavered. She flicked her fingers again, twice this time, a clear pattern that had been practiced countless times in secret. Each gesture, each movement, had a specific meaning. The dog's response was almost imperceptible, a slight shift in its posture, a movement that suggested it was paying attention. But no one, not even the people sitting closest to the girl, seemed to notice this quiet exchange. It was as if, in this tense courtroom, the little girl and her dog were the only two souls in the room who knew what was about to happen. And as the defense attorney prepared to finish his speech, the girl's eyes narrowed. There was something she knew, something that was hidden beneath the surface of this case, that no one else had yet discovered. This was no ordinary courtroom drama, and soon the world would learn just how deep the bond between a little girl and her dog really went. As the defense attorney wrapped up his argument, the air in the courtroom seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The room was silent except for the occasional shuffle of paper and the soft tapping of a pen against a desk. The prosecutor stood at the ready, preparing to counter the claims made by the defense. But the focus had shifted in the back row, where the little girl continued her quiet communication with her dog. Her fingers twitched again, more quickly this time, forming a precise sequence of movements. A subtle wave of her hand, a small, deliberate flick of her wrist. The dog, still sitting at the defense table, responded instantly. Its head turned slightly, its gaze sharpening as it caught the signal. It seemed to understand exactly what the girl was asking of it. The dog's stillness was uncanny. To anyone watching, it appeared as if it was simply following the rules, sitting quietly as any service animal would. But to the little girl, it was much more than that. It was a partner in a secret communication, one known only to them. She had trained the dog herself, teaching it to respond to her subtle gestures, to decode the quiet language they shared. She had learned over the years that her dog could sense things others couldn't. It had an uncanny ability to read her mood, her intentions, even when no words were spoken. And today, in the midst of this high-stakes trial, it was more than just a companion. It was her eyes, her ears, her silent protector. The girl's signals grew more urgent now, her hands moving in sharp, precise motions. The dog, still seated, tensed slightly. Its posture shifted ever so subtly, and its eyes flicked toward the judge, then toward the prosecutor, as if it was analyzing every movement in the room. It was clear that the dog was waiting for something. What was it waiting for? No one in the courtroom knew. To them, the dog was just a well-behaved service animal doing its job. But to the girl, it was more than that. She was asking it to watch, to listen, and to be ready. The judge, for a brief moment, glanced toward the back of the room where the little girl and her dog sat. He couldn't explain why, but something felt off. It was a subtle shift, a quiet disturbance in the atmosphere, as if something was about to happen. But his focus quickly returned to the case at hand. The defense attorney, oblivious to the silent exchange happening in the back row, finished his closing argument with a flourish. He turned to the jury, his voice smooth and confident. Yet, despite the theatrics, the courtroom felt strangely out of balance. A low hum of unease seemed to spread through the room. Most of the people in the courtroom hadn't noticed the little girl's signals or the dog's careful attention. They were focused on the trial, on the high-profile figures, and the legal strategies being deployed. But something about this moment, about the girl's quiet communication with her dog, held a deeper significance, one that the rest of the room was unaware of. The dog shifted again, its eyes locking with the girl's for a brief, knowing moment. The silent exchange continued, and the courtroom remained unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing just beneath the surface. The girl's signals had not gone unnoticed by the dog, but the real question was, what would happen next? The defense attorney's voice echoed in the courtroom, his final words hanging in the air. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the facts are clear. My client is innocent, and no evidence presented has proven otherwise. I trust you will find in favor of justice. He finished with a confident smile, his eyes sweeping across the room as though victory was already in his grasp. His hand was already reaching for the water bottle on the table, signaling the end of his argument. The prosecutor, who had been sitting quietly during the defense's closing statements, stood up. His posture was rigid, and his face, normally composed, was now taut with the kind of resolve that only came when he was certain of his ground. The courtroom grew silent once more as the prosecutor began his rebuttal. But at that very moment, the little girl's gestures intensified. Her fingers moved quicker now, more deliberately. The dog, still seated with remarkable composure, shifted its weight and seemed to focus its attention more sharply than before. The girl's eyes flicked nervously to her dog and then to the defense table, as though anticipating something. The sense of urgency in her signals was palpable. To anyone who knew the bond between the girl and her dog, it was clear something was about to happen, something that no one else could foresee. In the middle of the prosecutor's argument, a sudden, jarring sound broke the silence. It was the soft click of a door handle turning, so quiet yet so profound that it cut through the air. All eyes in the courtroom turned toward the sound. The door of the courtroom was opening, though it wasn't scheduled for any more entries. A figure stepped inside, someone unfamiliar. The judge's brow furrowed, and the jurors shifted in their seats, unsure of the intrusion. The man who had entered was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and his presence seemed to draw an electric tension into the room. Before anyone could react, the girl's hand shot up in a final, sharp motion. The dog, whose posture had been alert, reacted instantly, its body tense and prepared. In a single fluid movement, it leaped to its feet, its ears fully erect, eyes locked on the door. There was no time to waste. The dog had seen something no one else had. The judge hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The room had shifted from an orderly court session to a scene of palpable unease. The strange man, whose presence felt like an intrusion, slowly stepped forward as though drawn to something unseen. His every movement seemed deliberate, but no one knew yet why he was there or what he intended. As the courtroom held its collective breath, the dog's movements became even more pronounced. Its growl was low, almost imperceptible to the untrained ear, but unmistakable to those who knew how to listen. It was a warning that, for the moment, no one could comprehend. The girl's eyes narrowed, and she clenched her fists as if bracing for what was about to unfold. It was as if she knew, deep within her, that something more was happening, something that had nothing to do with the case at hand. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The room's quiet intensity was shattered. The courtroom was on edge, the sudden appearance of the mysterious man causing a ripple of confusion and fear. Everyone instinctively looked to the judge, who was now standing, his gavel poised in his hand, ready to regain control of the situation. But his attention, like the rest of the room, was fixated on the strange figure slowly making his way toward the defense table. The little girl's hand twitched again, her fingers moving with an urgency that left no room for doubt. It was as though she could feel something that no one else could, a danger lurking in the shadows, hidden from view. The dog, now fully alert, moved with a tense precision. It was clear to anyone who understood the bond between the girl and her dog that something was terribly wrong. The dog's eyes never left the mysterious man as he continued to move closer, his steps slow, deliberate, yet strangely calculated. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom as the jurors exchanged confused glances. The prosecutor, whose own attention had been momentarily drawn to the intruder, quickly regained his composure and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, who is this man? This is highly irregular. We've had no notice of additional witnesses or participants." The judge, still standing, scanned the man's figure carefully. He had no recollection of anyone being scheduled to speak, nor was there any indication that this individual was related to the case. His eyes flicked to the little girl once more. She was still calm, but her demeanor had shifted. Her face, normally composed, was now marked with an unmistakable concern. Her signals had intensified, and though her gestures were subtle, there was no mistaking the panic beginning to rise within her. The girl wasn't just warning the dog, she was warning everyone in the room. The dog, now standing beside her, began to growl softly, a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to reverberate through the courtroom. It was more than a mere reaction to the stranger's presence. It was a warning, a message from an animal attuned to the subtleties of danger that no human could yet comprehend. The dog's eyes were fixed on the man, but it was clear it wasn't just a passing discomfort. It was a profound sense of something approaching, something dangerous. A detective sitting at the back of the courtroom, who had been quietly observing the scene from afar, couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had begun to rise in him. He had noticed the dog's odd behavior, the girl's sudden change in demeanor, and the man's unsettling entrance. The detective's instincts, honed from years of experience, told him there was more to this than met the eye. He watched the man's movements carefully. There was something in his gait, the way he carried himself, that screamed confidence, not the typical nervousness of a bystander caught up in an unexpected situation. This man knew exactly where he was going, and he knew exactly what he was doing. And it didn't take long for the detective to make a chilling realization. The man was heading straight for the defense table, straight for the very spot where a key witness was seated, the one person whose testimony could change the fate of the trial. The dog's growl deepened, its body tense and coiled, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The little girl's eyes locked with her dog's, a silent command passing between them. The danger was real. It was coming closer, and no one else had yet realized it. The detective's hand slowly moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept his concealed weapon, ready to act if needed. But he knew, deep down, that whatever was about to happen, it would unfold far quicker than anyone could respond. And then, as if in slow motion, the man reached the defense table and did the unthinkable. The room, which had been filled with a low murmur of confusion and unease, fell into an eerie silence as the man reached the defense table. His every move was calculated, deliberate, and unsettling. The dog's growl had escalated, vibrating through the still air, and it was clear that something was amiss. The little girl's gaze never wavered from the man, her hand still signaling rapidly to her dog. The tension in the room was palpable, as though the very air itself had thickened with a sense of impending danger. The judge, standing at his podium, looked between the stranger and the growing unease in the courtroom. His instincts, honed over decades of presiding over cases, told him that something wasn't right. His hand, which had been clutching the gavel tightly, loosened. He looked down at the little girl, whose face was unreadable, but whose eyes were filled with a quiet urgency. It was as if she knew something that none of the adults in the room had yet realized. For a moment, the judge considered calling for a recess, but something stopped him. A deeper feeling nagged at the back of his mind. He glanced once more at the defense table, where the man was now standing, his face calm and unreadable, yet his posture was one of quiet menace. The judge's eyes narrowed in suspicion. He had seen this type of calculated behavior before. People who entered a room with a purpose, and yet there was no logical reason for this man to be here. The defense attorney, noticing the tension in the room, looked over his shoulder at the man approaching his table. His eyes narrowed, clearly confused but trying to remain composed. He opened his mouth to speak, but the prosecutor, ever vigilant, was already halfway to the judge, his face a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. "Your Honor, who is this man? This is highly irregular. We've had no notice of any new witnesses. Why is he here?" The judge didn't respond immediately. He couldn't shake the sense that this man's appearance was no coincidence. His mind raced, but his instincts told him that acting too quickly might jeopardize whatever was unfolding. His gaze moved from the prosecutor back to the little girl, who was now standing, her small body tense as she silently willed her dog into action. The dog, whose posture had been coiled with energy, let out a sharp, almost imperceptible bark. The sound seemed to freeze the room. The man at the defense table shifted slightly, his eyes flicking toward the dog, but there was no fear in his expression, only calculation. The judge could feel the tension in the room increase tenfold, like the quiet before a storm. His fingers hovered over the gavel, but he was still unwilling to act, uncertain of what exactly he was dealing with. The little girl's hand moved again, an unmistakable urgent signal to her dog. It was then that the judge realized that the girl and her dog were not just communicating with each other. They were communicating with the entire room, warning them of something none of them could yet see. The judge's suspicion deepened, and his eyes locked on the man once more. He wasn't just an unwelcome presence in the courtroom. He was something more, a threat, a danger that had arrived when no one expected it. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation, as the judge realized that he had just witnessed the first moment of a larger unfolding crisis. The courtroom, still gripped by an eerie tension, was at a breaking point. The dog's growl had ceased, replaced by a silence that seemed to carry the weight of an unseen threat. The strange man at the defense table was now just a few feet away from the witness stand. His presence was so out of place, so unsettling, that even the most seasoned courtroom attendees couldn't ignore the chill creeping up their spines. The little girl, her face now a mixture of determination and anxiety, stood motionless. Her small hands were raised in front of her, fingers moving quickly, almost desperately, in a series of precise gestures. Each flick of her wrist, each movement of her fingers was a signal to her dog, an unmistakable request to take action. Her dog, sensing the heightened urgency in her movements, remained still for only a moment longer. Then, as though on cue, it sprang into motion. The room's attention was drawn to the dog as it bounded toward the defense table with shocking speed and precision. There was no hesitation, no confusion. It was as if the dog had been waiting for this exact moment. With one fluid motion, it launched itself forward, its eyes locked on the man who stood near the defense witness chair. The courtroom gasped in unison, the entire room frozen in disbelief. The judge's gavel fell sharply, but it was drowned out by the sudden, overwhelming chaos. "Stop! Stop the dog!" the defense attorney yelled, rising from his chair in a panic, but his voice was lost amidst the sound of the dog's swift movements. The dog reached the defense table, its body poised with perfect precision. In one swift, fluid motion, it leaped onto the table, its nose inches from the man's coat. The audience could barely process what they were seeing. The dog wasn't attacking, it was searching, moving with a purpose, as if it knew exactly what it was looking for. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. In the midst of the confusion, the prosecutor stood motionless, his hand hovering near his phone, as though he might call for backup or signal law enforcement. But before he could act, the dog made its next move. With a swift motion, it nudged aside a stack of papers on the defense table, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, partially concealed under a file folder, was something that no one had expected: a gun. A gasp of shock echoed throughout the courtroom. The air seemed to disappear as everyone, from the jurors to the judge, realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. The dog's action had exposed a weapon, hidden in plain sight, one that could have turned the entire trial into a deadly confrontation. The judge, still stunned, rose to his feet. "Security!" he barked, his voice now firm and commanding. "Clear the courtroom. No one leaves until we investigate this." The strange man, whose calm demeanor had seemed so controlled moments ago, now visibly flinched. He stepped back, his face pale, as if suddenly aware that his plan was unraveling before his eyes. The defense attorney's expression was a mix of disbelief and panic as he looked between the judge, the prosecutors, and the now exposed gun. He knew this would ruin everything, but he had no idea how much damage had already been done. Amid the chaos, the little girl stood firm, her gaze unwavering from the dog that had just prevented a catastrophe. Her eyes met the judge's, and for the first time, he understood. She had known all along. She had seen the threat, and her bond with her dog had saved the day. The courtroom was in shock, and the events that had just unfolded would forever change the course of the trial. The question now was, what had brought this hidden danger to the heart of the justice system? And why had no one else seen it coming? The courtroom was a scene of pure chaos. The judge's voice echoed in the now panic-stricken room, but his command was barely heard over the confusion. "Get that weapon out of here," he shouted again as officers quickly rushed to the defense table. The dog, now standing beside the chair, looked around, its stance protective and unwavering, as if making sure no one else approached the dangerous object. Security officers moved swiftly, stepping around the defense table to secure the gun that had been hidden beneath the stack of papers. The strange man, whose composure had cracked, was now looking for an exit, his face twisted in a mix of fear and anger. The defense attorney, too, was paralyzed by the magnitude of what had just happened, his hands trembling at his sides. The little girl, though small and often overlooked, remained a calm center in the chaos. She hadn't moved from her place. Her focus was still on her dog, her hand dropping to her side as though signaling that the crisis had passed for now. The dog's intense eyes stayed locked on the man, watching him carefully as the security officers began to remove him from the room. There was a moment of silence before the room erupted with questions and shocked murmurs. The judge, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, gestured for everyone to quiet down. "Everyone, please," he commanded. His voice, though strained, held authority. "This court will not tolerate this kind of disruption. Officers, take this man into custody immediately. We'll resume this session after an investigation." As the strange man was escorted out, the courtroom buzzed with frantic whispers. What had just happened? How had this weapon gone unnoticed by everyone until now? And who was the mysterious man? And why was he carrying a weapon into the heart of a high-profile trial? But it wasn't just the weapon that had left everyone in disbelief. The dog, standing sentinel beside the defense table, had not only exposed the hidden threat, but had prevented a disaster before it could unfold. The little girl's calm demeanor spoke volumes to those who were paying attention. She had known. She had seen something the rest of them had missed. The prosecutor, still reeling from the events that had just transpired, turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we need to address the fact that this individual was not only in this courtroom, but had access to a weapon. We need to investigate the connection between him and the defense team. This is a breach of security and could have been catastrophic." The judge nodded solemnly, his eyes scanning the room. "Indeed, we will investigate. And as for you, young lady," he said, turning toward the little girl, his tone softer now, "you've done something today that we all need to recognize. You've saved this courtroom from a tragedy. I don't know how you knew what was happening, but you were the one who saw the threat." The little girl met his gaze, her eyes calm and unwavering. She wasn't one for attention, but today she had become the hero. Her connection with her dog had been the key to stopping a disaster no one else had seen coming. As the officers continued their work, and the murmurs of disbelief settled into stunned silence. One thing became clear to everyone in that courtroom. The case was no longer just about the trial. The real story had just begun. The mystery surrounding the man with the weapon and the girl who had seen the threat would soon be the focus of everyone's attention. The courtroom had been forever changed, and no one would forget the little girl who had stopped a tragedy with nothing but a signal and a bond with her dog. The chaos in the courtroom had died down, but the weight of the events that had just unfolded hung in the air. The man who had entered the courtroom with such disturbing intent was now in police custody, but his true motives were still a mystery. Officers had already begun questioning him, but the answers they had received so far were incomplete and vague. The defense attorney, still in a state of shock, had been escorted out for questioning as well. The courtroom, which had once been filled with anticipation over the trial, was now filled with an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The judge, having regained some composure, addressed the room once again. His voice was steady, though it carried an edge of disbelief. This trial is postponed indefinitely. We will reconvene once the investigation into the events that transpired today is complete. I expect full cooperation from everyone involved. The jury, visibly shaken, was escorted out of the courtroom, their minds surely reeling from the unexpected turn of events. The prosecutors and defense lawyers exchanged looks, both equally bewildered by the mysterious man's presence and the dog's role in thwarting whatever plan had been set into motion. But for the little girl and her dog, the real story had only just begun. The courtroom buzzed with conversations, but she and her dog stood quietly at the back, waiting for the attention to shift away. The girl's calm demeanor hadn't wavered since the moment the gun had been revealed, and she seemed to be the only one unaffected by the frenzy that had engulfed the room. A detective approached her, his face full of curiosity and gratitude. "You saved all of us today," he said, his voice soft but filled with genuine admiration. "How did you know what was going to happen?" The girl met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at her dog, who was still standing beside her, as though guarding her from anything that might try to approach. The bond between them was clear. There was something deeper, something beyond words, that connected them in a way no one could fully understand. She knew, the detective repeated, his eyes softening as he looked at the girl and her dog. Somehow, she knew what was coming. It was then that the little girl finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "He wasn't supposed to be here. My dog saw him before anyone else did." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. The dog had seen the man before anyone else. How could that be possible? The detective had seen the dog's behavior, alert, focused, and poised, but it still didn't answer the question of why the man had been there, what his true intentions were, and how the girl had been able to recognize the threat when no one else had. As the courtroom slowly emptied, with security personnel continuing their investigation, the air remained thick with unanswered questions. The girl and her dog remained at the center of it all, but their involvement raised even more doubts. Had this been a carefully orchestrated attempt to derail the trial? Or was the man simply a lone actor with his own agenda? The detective knew that the investigation was far from over. But one thing was certain. This case had taken a turn none of them had expected. And somewhere, in the shadows of the courtroom, the little girl and her dog held the key to unlocking the truth behind the mysterious intruder and the chilling chain of events that had unfolded in front of everyone's eyes. As the doors of the courtroom closed behind them, the world outside seemed uncertain, just as uncertain as the future of the trial itself. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again.